All right. Now we've covered the first part of the learning process here. That was step one. What are the main kinds of rubrics teachers use? And we looked at holistic and analytic rubrics. Now the next step is, how do I design an effective user-friendly rubric? Well, let's first take a look at a simple grading rubric like this. What we see here is, let's break it down and really look at what the rubric is. Okay, so what we see here is, what are we assessing? What is the test? What is the assignment? In this case, it's a history research paper. Okay, now here along the left side, we have the criterion. So what should be included? What are we assessing? What should students be able to show that they've learned in this history research paper? Well, we want them to include sources, right? Outside external source material. We want the paper to be historically accurate. We want the paper to be well organized. And we also want the students to include bibliography. So we have 4 criterion here that they'll be marked on. Now, wait, let's back up a second. Take a moment and think, what kind of a rubric is this? Is it holistic or is it analytic? Now, that's right. In looking at the criteria, you can already see this is an analytic rubric because it divides the criterion into different areas, right? And then what we see is, now I would have designed it the other way from 1 to 3, but okay. Here we have, when would the person score poorly for a number of sources? Well, if they include 1 to 4 sources, that's not so great. They only get 1 point for that. If in terms of historical accuracy, there are lots of historical inaccuracies, that would be a poor outcome there, right? They wouldn't have done well. If you, the reader, cannot tell from which source information came, then that's considered poor organization. And if the bibliography contains very little information, that would be poor. Let's move up the scale. Good. So in terms of level of performance and score, this is where the student would get 2 points. So if they include 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 sources, there are few inaccuracies in the research paper. If the reader, that's you, the teacher, can tell with some difficulty, it's a little bit hard, but you can still tell where information came from. And if the bibliography contains most relevant information, then the student would get 2 points, and that would be considered good. Now, when does the student score in the excellent range and get 3 points? If they include 10, 11, or 12 sources, if there are no apparent inaccuracies in the history in the paper, if you, the reader, the teacher, can easily tell from which sources information was drawn, like you look at their meal paragraphs, you look at their paragraphing, and you can easily see in the organization of the essay or the research paper where they included their brona, their sources. And lastly, the bibliography. All the relevant bibliographic information is included. So author, date of publication, journal, book, website. Okay. This is a simple grading rubric. Now let's just spend a few more minutes looking at, and this was from the Northern Illinois University Faculty Development and Instructional Design Center, an analytic rubric. Well, what are the steps? Let's go through them. And according to this website, okay, there are 6 steps. Sorry. And here they are. How to create a rubric in 6 steps. Okay. Step 1, define your goal. You need to decide the type of rubric you'd like to use, and that will largely be determined by your goals for the assessment. So, how detailed do you want feedback to be? How will you break down expectations for the project, the assignment, the test? Are all of the tasks equally important? How do you want to assess performance? What standards must the students hit, right? So that they get at least an acceptable or perhaps an exceptional performance. Do you, the teacher, want to give one final grade or a cluster of smaller grades? And are you grading based on work, participation, grading both? So these are all things that you think about as a teacher, and this really has to do with what's the goal of the assessment? What are you trying to measure with the test, the project, the assignment, the presentation, right? Okay, now you choose a type of rubric, either analytic or holistic. Again, thinking about what we already know about the pros and cons of each type, right? The next step is to determine the criteria. Now, what do we mean by that? Let's go back for a second. Determining the criteria. So what goes here? Now, if you're designing an analytic rubric, how are you going to break it down? Again, if it's a paper, you'll probably include something about organization, source material, right? You might include language. We're language teachers, so we might have a criterion here that includes the level of English. All right. So when we're determining our criteria, this is where the learning objectives for the course, that is, we call them learning aims. What are the long-term goals of the course, the class, the module? Yeah, try to stick with 4 to 7. You don't want too many. And okay, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and show you an example. And then, in terms of the steps, now this might look sort of familiar. For our program, students had to follow a course called Argumentative Speaking and Writing, academic argumentation. And they were asked to submit, do you remember, a video of themselves presenting an argument. Now, this was a pass-fail assignment. So this is a little bit easier for the rubric. You have the pass criterion, or descriptors, and the fail descriptors. Okay, pretty clear. Now, how did we break down the criterion? We broke it down into thesis statement. If the thesis statements are clear and debatable, it would be a pass. Here's our bit about source material or evidence, that when the person was doing their video recorded argumentative speech, they delivered relevant, credible evidence when they were making their points. We considered it quite important in this assignment that the student demonstrate that you were able to show a degree of open-mindedness and be able to argue both the pro and the con side. Of course, we wanted the argumentation to be logically organized and follow a structure with an intro, body, and conclusion, even in a speech. We, of course, needed to look at language, so the speaking, that the person would speak clearly, conveying the message effectively. And what we did not want, we learned from experience, that because this was a recording, a video recording, quite often students would simply read from a script. So we added this criterion, authentic delivery, that the student had to speak naturally and maintain eye contact with the viewer. So it's more like a presentation. So this is a very simple rubric, and I'm going to end this video now. and I'll present another video in which I show you how we determine the criteria. Now, what we saw again was, where does the criteria come from? Well, it comes from the learning aims of the unit or the course. Okay, thanks for watching, and we'll move on to step 3 in a moment.